Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I might have earned your subscription. What I'm going to be covering today is part 4 of my V-shaped guitar build. And specifically what I'm going to be doing is building a 3D model of the neck. So I'm going to let you follow along from start to finish in real time, no speeding things up. This is going to be start to finish in the actual time that it takes me to build this neck. So let's jump on the computer and get started. First thing I got to do is create a new document in Rhinoceros, and I like working in the perspective view. Now I'm not going to give blow-by-blow details here. I'm just going to kind of cover it in a sort of an overview. But what I've done is I've imported my Adobe Illustrator file into Rhinoceros, and it comes in at 100% size. Now, I don't need all the elements, so I deleted some of those that I don't need and kept the ones that I will use. And it's basically the perimeter shape as well as the contour, the heel shapes, the headstock shapes, and all that. And as I create this 3D neck, I think the best thing to do is, as you watch this, because I'm not cutting anything out here, I'm showing every step of the process, and I'm also doing it in real-time speed, so I'm not speeding up anything here. But if you want to see in detail what I'm doing, you can stop and rewind it, that sort of thing. Also, if I do something and you're not quite sure you understand what I'm doing, if you need an explanation, you can always post a comment down in the comment section, and I'll do my best to try to answer it. But just keep in mind, I'm not trying to become a software tutorial guru. I build guitars, but I use software to build the guitars. So just keep that in mind. So I may not be able to answer your questions to your satisfaction, but I'll certainly try. And another thing that's important to understand is what I'm building here is it's basically like a frame covered with a skin. I think that's the best way to understand how 3D models like this are built. And then once that model is complete, I'm going to export it out as an STL file. And that STL file is what I use to generate the G-code from the tool paths that I assign to it. So it's pretty simple, straightforward process. A lot of folks, I think, are intimidated by the idea of creating three-dimensional files like this using these 3D programs, because they are, for those who have never used it, it can be very awkward to use. But once you start to do it, it goes pretty quickly. And I can generate a neck, as you're about to see, in less than 30 minutes. It goes very quickly. Now, I'm not going to say that my files are absolutely perfect. Some of you watching who have even more experience than I do with generating 3D models, you may find that there are different approaches to doing it, and even different software programs that might possibly make models that are more accurate. There are also certain techniques and certain capabilities of the software that will ensure a high degree of precision with all the different surfaces that I'm creating here. And I don't really bother with it too much, because I've found that the way I build the models and create the STL files, they work just fine for creating a neck on a CNC machine, or a body, or even the fretboard. And I don't have too much difficulty with regards to the accuracy and the continuity between different surfaces and how everything flows together. I've just never had an issue with that. And besides, I know that once I've carved the neck, because we're working in wood, I'm still going to have to do some sanding. You know, hopefully not a whole lot of sanding, but I'm going to have to still sand the surface to get rid of some of the tool marks and some of the slight imperfections. So oftentimes I don't worry about getting all the contours absolutely perfect, although with this neck, they will be pretty close to perfect. But if I see something that isn't exactly perfect, I can make a judgment call as to whether or not that's going to pose an issue when I generate it. And in most cases, if I see there's going to be a problem, I'll continue to work in the 3D model to correct it. But if there isn't going to be an issue, I know that I'm going to have to sand it anyway. So a lot of times I'll just go back in and sand out any potential flaw that might exist, even though it's likely not going to be sufficient enough to warrant a problem. I'll just sand it and go on. But like I said, if there is going to be an issue, then I will correct it. And sometimes that takes a little bit of work to try to figure out exactly how to correct it because, like I said, these programs are not always the easiest programs to use. They are very complex and sophisticated. And, a lot of folks, people will ask me all the time if I'd be willing to generate 3D models that they can use. And I could do that. And I've thought about doing STL files for the plants that I sell on my eGuitar Plans website. However, like I said, my files sometimes aren't absolutely perfect. And I kind of feel like it would be not really the best practice to sell somebody an STL file that isn't made to absolute best practice standards. But who knows? Maybe I'm underestimating my skill at doing this because I've been doing this for a number of years now, and I've really had no issues. But at the same time, I haven't had other resources to compare my work to. So it seems to me like what I'm doing works just fine. So I may end up doing that somewhere down the road. Who knows? We'll see. Okay, so let's get back to the work at hand here. One thing I should mention is as you watch me creating this, you'll notice that I am generating the model from the back side of the neck, the contour side. And it really doesn't matter what direction it's in, but it's important to understand that when you build a model like this and then save out the STL file, that's the view that the CAM program is going to recognize when it's imported. So when I import this model, it's going to see the back side of the neck. And to do the other side, the top side of the neck, there's a couple of different strategies for doing that. And I'll explain that a little bit later in this video, but it's really important with respect to how we do what I like to call work and turn manufacturing. And what that is you work one side, and then when you're done, you turn it and work the other side. It's an old printer's term. So I apply it to this because basically, even though this is subtractive manufacturing, which is what CNC technology is, it's not that much different than the technology that's used in 3D printing, which is additive manufacturing. So you could almost think of a CNC machine as a printer, but it's not actually laying down material like the 3D printer does. It's removing it. So I like to borrow some of the printing terms that I've used in the past when in a previous life I was working in the graphics and printing industry. As you watch the work that I'm doing, it may not make a lot of sense, but let me try and give you a way to think about this that might help it make sense. Part of the problem is that you're looking at a 3D world, but presented on a two-dimensional screen. So sometimes it's hard to tell from perspective viewpoint what is happening. And so when things flip around, it's like it can be confusing, and it takes a while to get used to that. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm creating a frame, sort of like the frame of a house. And all of these parts of the frame are what's going to support the surface, or the skin, if you want to call it that. So when you're creating that frame, you have to think about what is the most efficient way to fill the space that needs to be filled. And that's kind of what I'm doing here as I prepare the frame and then cover it with a surface for the heel portion of the neck. And the gray surfaces that you see on the screen right there, that represents the tenon that's going to be inserted into the body. And I'm building out around that where the front of the neck will be and where the transition from the tenon into the back contour will be. And the best way to do it is to create shapes that will fill that space that I can fill with the surface. And it has to be done in sections. Now, some of you watching will say, well, why don't you do it this way, or why don't you do it that way? You could have built that as, one solid shape instead of multiple shapes. And yes, I can, but this way works fine too. And really, there gets to a point where you're not really saving a lot of time using different approaches or techniques. It's just different ways of doing it. And, it's not necessarily going to be saving a lot of time. So, and I also like to have the different shapes in case I need to make changes later on. It just makes it a lot quicker to do it. With each shape that gets filled with a surface, it starts to make sense what's going on here. And hopefully, as you're watching this, you're going, oh, yeah, okay, I see what's going on. I understand how this works. But it takes time to figure out a strategy for creating these files. And when I first started building my necks using Rhinoceros, it could take several days, working a couple of hours each day to get the neck completed and to finish it. But as time has passed and I've gotten more confident and fluent in using the program, it's getting a lot faster. And as I mentioned earlier, to take this neck from a blank document to a finished 3D neck takes about 30 minutes. The version of Rhino that I'm using is the latest version of Rhino 5 for the Macintosh. I do all my design work on my Macintosh, and that's only because I've been using Macs since the very first version of the Apple Macintosh, clear back in like 1985 or 86, something like that. I can't even remember. Anyway, there are later versions of Rhino that are available. However, Rhino is not a free program. It costs money. And when I purchased Rhino 5, of course, I got all the updates for Rhino 5, which are free. However, if I want to upgrade to, say, Rhino 7, which is, I think, the current version, I have to pay the upgrade price. And right now, I just don't see a compelling reason to do that. I'm perfectly happy with how Rhino 5 builds files that I need for generating 3D models for CNC workflow. So I'm just going to stick with Rhino 5 for a while. And I may upgrade at some point in the future, as I'm also planning to upgrade my Mac to one of the new silicone Macs. That's something that will happen probably sometime this year, and it may be beneficial at that point to upgrade to Rhino, as the later versions will probably support the silicone chip. So we'll see. Now, when I use Rhino, as I said, I'm building out a structure, sort of like the framework of a house, which is what I'm doing here. I'm drawing lines that are connecting the segments of the back contour templates. And what those lines will do is they will help the surface conform to that contour more consistently and reliably. However, I'm also going to use those lines that I'm drawing to create extensions that are going to be used to help guide my use of the curves. And I'm creating those extensions right now, and they extend back a couple of inches into the neck. And those extensions are sort of like reference lines, which will make sense here in a minute as I form the shape of the transition from the volute down into the neck contour, as well as the heel into the neck contour. So I just have to create those and get those positioned. As I work to build out the surface shapes, sometimes I have to hide some of the surfaces that I've already created so that I can get a better view of the area that I'm working in. Because as you can see, looking at all these lines that form the frame of the neck, it can be kind of hard to see what's going on. But what I'm doing now is I'm creating the transition from the volute down into the contour of the neck. And that's what I use those line extensions for. When you draw a curve in Rhino, it's not like when you draw a curve with a pencil on a sheet of paper. The curve is wherever you move that pencil. But in this case, you have to indicate where the start of the curve is going to be, then where the middle of the curve is, and then where the finish is going to be. So I use those lines to help determine and to help me accurately position where I need the middle of that curve to be. And that's sort of how it's formed. And if you look closely, words come up wherever I'm positioning the cursor. When it says perpendicular, that's where I need the middle of the curve to be with respect to that line extension. When you build a house, you're creating a framework of studs and joists and rafters and things like that for the outer skin of the house, the sheetrock and stuff, to adhere to or to be attached to. And that's what I'm doing here in Rhinos. I'm creating the framework. And this is necessary because the surfaces that I'm going to apply to these structures they're essentially flat. They have no idea what shape to take. So you need to create this framework in order for the surface to know what it's going to adhere to. So the more structure you create, the more accurate your surface is going to be when it adheres to this structure of the framework. And also with Rhino, when you surface an area, you can't have an unlimited number of structural pieces which enclose the shape. You have to limit the number, and at least around the perimeter, in order for the surface to work. So I have to connect some of my segmented pieces together. And then once I surface it, obviously you can see how that's going to look. At this stage, I can then bring back the elements that I hid earlier, and you can start to see how this shape is finishing out. I just got to fill in a couple of last pieces of that transition from the headstock into the neck contour. Once I have finished surfacing this area, I need to get rid of those reference extension lines that I drew earlier and used to form that contour shape. So I'll just select that surface and I'll hide it temporarily. And then what I can do is just use my trim tool to select all those lines that I'm going to trim. I still need the lines where they go from between the two contour templates, but I don't need what's extending beyond it. So I'll just use the trim tool, and then I'll select the curve, and then I'll just hit return, and I'm able to delete those extensions because they're unnecessary at this point. And then once I've deleted all those lines, I can bring back that surface. And at this point, it is time to switch from one end of the neck to the other. And now what I'm going to do is start to work on the transition from the heel into the next contour. And it's essentially the exact same process that I just did with the transition between the volute and the what will be the contour of the neck. I'm going to use those extensions to guide the creation of my curve framework. Now, the key to correctly making the framework for surfacing in Rhino is to pay close attention to the words that appear as I'm forming those lines. And it depends on where along the line you're positioning the cursor. And what I'm doing in this particular instance is I'm looking for the words end intersection to start the line, then perpendicular on that reference line, and then end intersection at the end of it. And if I get those words as I'm forming that line and click in those positions, I know that my line is going to be correctly formed. And with Rhino, it can be a little bit touchy. If you're not exactly in the right position, the line won't be formed correctly. But you'll know that because the words that you see won't be the words that you're looking for. So once you have the correct words appearing next to the cursor, you can click to set the point and then move to the next one. Once I have completed building the structure for the transition between the heel and the contour, I can then prepare to apply the surface to the structure. Before I can do that, however, I need to select all the segments that form that contour curve and join them back together. And that is so I can delete the extension on those lines that I used as guides. So I'll use my trim tool to select those lines, and then I will select the contour curve, which will dictate where those lines will be split, and then I can just delete those excess portions, and that just cleans up the area a little bit. Then what I have to do is I have to select all the segments of that the heel curve there and join those together, because you see the way Rhino works when it comes to surfacing a network of lines like this is you can only have between 3 and 4 perimeter lines that define the shape that you're going to fill with a surface. You can't have 2 and you can't have more than 4. It just won't work. So I've got 4 sides like a box, and then those internal lines are the curve that the surface will adhere to as it's formed. At this stage, what I can do is select the contour curve at the headstock as well as at the heel. Then I can select all the lines that are running in between those 2 curves, and from that I can generate the surface that's going to cover that back contour. Of course, I haven't forgotten about the other surfaces that I created for the heel, which I had to hide when I formed that transition area. So I'll just bring those back so we can see them. And I still have one other piece to fill in, which is the bottom of the heel there. And I'll just fill that with a planar surface. And for the most part, the entire back of the neck is completely finished. And most of the other side is finished as well, but I still have to fill some of these surfaces in. And what I have to do in the case of this heel is I have to generate curves from the edge, since there were no curves there to begin with. So I'll do that, and then I'll fill in that surface, and then I'll just start grabbing all the other bits and pieces that form the contour of the top of the neck. And there are multiple pieces here because they were all split apart in order to form the different surfaces. So once I have selected all those bits and pieces, I have basically the top surface where the fretboard is going to be glued to selected, and then I can surface that, and that completes the entire fabrication of the neck. Now it comes time to save it. So to keep things organized, I'm going to create a new folder and call it neck files. And this first file I'm going to save is the neck back. And this is saved in the native Rhino file format, so if I need to edit it, I can do so very easily. Next, I'll export the file as an STL, which is stereolithograph, and that's the format that my MeshCam software prefers. And I've experimented over the years with the settings, and what you see here are the ones that I find to be the most effective.
Since I'm going to be carving this neck on my CNC machine, I'm going to have to carve both sides, the back that you just saw me create as well as the top. So what I need to do is I need to flip the geometry 180 degrees and save out a file for that toolpath.
I'll duplicate the file, and then what I need to do is go into the front view, select all of the model's geometry, and then flip it 180 degrees. However, there's a problem here. If I copy all this geometry that I just flipped and then go back to my original neck back file and then view from the top, I can then paste that flipped geometry in. And as you can see, it doesn't match up. It's off slightly. And that's because when this geometry is centered on the blank, the centering is based off of the width of the headstock, which is wider on one side than it is the other. And if you look closely here, you can see my gimbal is not centered over the middle of that neck contour curve. It's slightly shifted off to the left, so it's not going to work. However, there's an easy fix for that. And what I'll do is I'll make a duplicate of that neck back file. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to import my original guitar neck artwork that I created in Illustrator. And then I'll deselect the perimeter of the blank and get rid of all of the other elements. Then what I can do is select all the geometry and once again flip it 180 degrees. And as you can see, my gimbal is right in the center of that contour. So I can be assured that when this is flipped, it's going to be positioned correctly. And I can check that by selecting that flipped geometry, going back to the neck back file into the top view, and then I'll paste that copied geometry, and as you can see, it now lines up perfectly. So that's how I fix that.
Now you may be wondering, couldn't I just save out one version of this file, like the back, and then when I import the STL into my CAM software, I could just flip it there? Well, I could. However, my CAM software doesn't allow me to check and see if the two sides are going to line up with each other. I can do that in Rhino, so I just prefer to do it that way. Then I can import one STL file for the back into my CAM software, set up the tool paths, and write the G-code. Then I can import the top and do the same thing and be assured that when I do the work and turn process on my CNC machine, both sides of the blank and what's carved are going to line up perfectly.
Now I can go back to my correctly flipped duplicate file and save that as, I'll call it the neck top. And not only will I save out the native
Rhino file, but I'll also export an STL so I can bring that into my CAM program later on.
All right, well, there you have it. That is the process I go through in Rhino to build a 3D model of a neck that I'm going to carve on my CNC machine. And as you can see from this video, it took a little less than 30 minutes to make the neck. So I think I'm going to end this episode at this stage. And what I'm going to do in part 5 is I'm going to let you follow along in the same way as I bring the STL files into MeshCam to set up the tool paths and then write the G-code. So I hope you'll join me for that. In the meantime, as always, I hope if you enjoyed this video, you'll give it a thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, again, welcome. I hope I've earned your subscription. And if you would like to show the channel support so that I can keep making these videos, be sure to either head over to eguitarplans.com, link in the description below, and purchase plans for building guitars and making the tools that we use to build guitars, including a CNC machine and a CNC pickup winder. Or you can visit my merch shelf down below and purchase not only the same kind of plans, but some t-shirts as well. So until the next episode, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for part 5.